After World War II, the entire planet was just hoping for a lasting peace. But what we got instead was something totally different. A tense 45-year standoff between two superpowers that ended up shaping the entire world as we know it today.
Think about it. The United States and the Soviet Union, they fought on the same side to beat Hitler. So how in the world did they immediately turn around and become these incredibly bitter rivals, locked in a global struggle for dominance? That's the big question we're going to unpack right now.
So first, let's get the main definition out of the way. The Cold War was this huge confrontation that lasted for decades. But the name is the really interesting part. Why cold? Well, it's because the two big players, the US and the USSR, never actually went to war directly with each other. The threat of total nuclear annihilation was just way too real for that.
Okay, so how did this all start? Well, picture this. World War II is over. The old European powers are completely exhausted. This creates a massive power vacuum, and two very, very different nations step up to fill it, basically splitting the world right down the middle.
So on one side, you've got the Western Bloc, led by the United States. They're all about capitalism, free markets, and individual liberty. And on the other side, you've got the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union. They believed that capitalism was just doomed to fail and that a worldwide communist revolution was the only way forward. And let's be clear, these weren't just slightly different ideas. They were complete opposites about how human society should even work.
And this clash of ideas wasn't just some abstract debate, It very quickly created a real, physical, and political border that just sliced right through the heart of Europe.
It really started at the negotiating table. At these big conferences in places like Yalta and Potsdam, the Allied leaders got together to figure out what to do with post-war Europe. And yeah, they agreed on some things, like dividing up Germany and prosecuting Nazi war criminals, but even then, under all the handshakes, there was this deep, growing mistrust, especially about the future of Eastern Europe, where the Soviet army was already in control.
And then, Winston Churchill comes out with this incredible, chilling phrase that just perfectly captured the moment: an iron curtain. It wasn't a real wall just yet, but it was such a powerful image for this new dividing line between the free West and the Soviet-controlled East. The separation was becoming a fact of life.
Then, a series of big moves made this division rock solid. First, the US rolls out the Marshall Plan, pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe. Now, this wasn't just about being nice. It was a genius move to build up strong capitalist allies and stop communism from spreading and all that post-war chaos. Next up, the military alliances. In '49, the West creates NATO, basically saying, an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. So of course, the Soviets respond by creating their own version in 1955, the Warsaw Pact. And just like that, the teams were set.
And then, that metaphorical curtain became a brutal, concrete reality. In the years after the war, something like 15 million people had already fled from the Soviet-controlled East to find freedom in the West. To slam the door on this mass exodus, East Germany, with the full backing of the Soviets, literally built the Berlin Wall overnight in 1961. It became the most powerful and heartbreaking symbol of the entire Cold War.
Now, even though the US and the USSR never came to direct blows, the Cold War was anything but peaceful. Oh no. They basically turned other countries into battlegrounds for their bigger fight, fueling conflicts all across the globe.
These were the infamous proxy wars. When the communists under Mao Zedong won the civil war in China, it was seen as a massive win for the Soviets. Then came the Korean War, where American troops had to fight to defend South Korea from a communist invasion from the north. And then, of course, there was Vietnam, a long, brutal, and costly war that really became a defining moment for the United States. In every single one of these conflicts, the superpowers were backing opposite sides.
But the single moment the world came closest to just complete nuclear annihilation was in 1962. The Soviets secretly put nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. When the U.S. found them, President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade. For 13 terrifying days, the entire world just held its breath, watching as Soviet ships sailed right for that blockade line. And then, at the very, very last second, the Soviet premier, Khrushchev, blinked. He ordered the ships to turn back. We all dodged a nuclear bullet, but just barely.
But the fighting wasn't just happening on the ground. The Cold War was also fought in the shadows, with spies, and up in the heavens with rockets. Each side was absolutely desperate to prove that its system was technologically and morally superior.
And this played out in the incredible space race.
First, the Soviets landed a huge blow in 1957 when they launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite. That was a shock. Then they put the first man in space. But in the end, the US captured what was seen as the ultimate prize, landing a man on the moon in 1969. It was this epic competition for bragging rights, a way to show off your power without ever firing a missile.
And of course, this was the golden age of spycraft. You had the CIA and the KGB locked in this constant secret war of intelligence gathering, defections, and covert ops. And at the same time, both sides were just flooding the world with propaganda, each one trying to paint the other as this evil aggressor hell-bent on destroying world peace. For decades, it honestly seemed like this divided world was just a way things were going to be forever. But then, in the 1980s, the pressure started to build and build, leading to a conclusion that was just absolutely stunning and incredibly fast.
A whole new, much more confrontational phase started with leaders like US President Ronald Reagan. And this guy, he did not mince words. He famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire and openly said that communism was headed for the ash heap of history. This was a huge shift from the diplomacy of the past.
And this wasn't just tough talk. It became official U.S. policy with something called the Reagan Doctrine. The goal was no longer just to contain communism, to keep it from spreading. The new goal was to actively roll it back. The U.S. started funding and supporting anti-communist rebels all over the world, putting incredible pressure on an already struggling Soviet system. By the end of the 1980s, you could see the cracks forming in the Soviet bloc. The system was crumbling from the inside. And then came one single, unbelievable year that changed the map of the world forever.
On November 9, 1989, the absolute unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall, that ultimate symbol of division, came down. Crowds of people from both East and West Berlin just swarmed the checkpoints, climbing on the wall and tearing it down with hammers in their bare hands. It was an incredible moment.
The fall of that wall set off a chain reaction, a real domino effect. It was truly the beginning of the end. That Iron Curtain that had divided Europe for 2 generations was lifted. The entire communist bloc just started to dismantle, piece by piece. The Cold War was over. And in this amazing historical twist, most of these former communist countries raced to adopt the very capitalist system they had been taught to hate their whole lives.
So yeah, the big standoff between the US and the Soviet Union is over. But when you look at the world today, at things like the expansion of NATO, the ongoing tensions in Eastern Europe, or the new technological race with China, you realize that so many of the rivalries and alliances from that time are still shaping our lives. So it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Did the Cold War ever truly end, or are we all still just living in its long shadow?